Our purpose today is to hear from Lord Carey of Clifton, who is the former Archbishop of Canterbury, and by the way, Eileen Carey is also here, Lady Eileen. He is visiting because he is the chair of the World Faiths Development Dialogue, which is an enterprise that we realized is marking its 10th anniversary. So we're taking advantage of his being here to give us some reflections about the NGO, which is part of the Berkley Center. But I'm sure that he'll be happy to answer any other questions. What we've suggested is that George speak for a little while, and then we'll have an exchange. I will not go into your full biography. Recommend your autobiography, wonderful book that he wrote, and he might be persuaded to give you some insights into what an Archbishop of Canterbury does on occasions like royal weddings and funerals, as well, of course, as the interfaith dialogue, which was one of his passions when he was Archbishop of Canterbury. And happily for us, another of his passions was inspiring and helping religious leaders from many different traditions, not only to care about the world's poor, but to translate that into much more effective action. So that is the mission that keeps him actively involved.
Alive, yes.
So, welcome, George.
Thank you very much indeed, Catherine. Do I need to speak into this so that you can hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Ron, thank you. Well, I want to say, together with Eileen, our thanks to Catherine, who's a very dear friend, and she is the person at the very heart of WFDD. When Catherine asked me, invited me to say something at this meeting, I wondered really what to talk about, and I'm certainly not going to talk about royal weddings, by the way. During my time, 11 and a half years, I didn't conduct one royal wedding at all. I was the funeral Archbishop of Canterbury. I conducted 3 funerals, Diana's, the Queen Mother, and Princess Margaret, and they were all massive events, particularly Diana's. What I thought I would do, I want to say something about WFDD, but I want to put it in the context of my own pilgrimage as a Christian, as a leader, and where I am today in this issue of development and so on. And to begin with, I just want to keep an eye on the time. Let me see, okay, I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes so we can have a full discussion. I was brought up in the evangelical tradition in the Church of England, and one of the things about the evangelical tradition, it's had a very honourable history of commitment to the poor. You've only got to think of William Wilberforce and slavery. He came from that tradition. You've got to think of old Shaftesbury and the factory laws and so on. You think of Thomas Bernardo and children's work, and there are many other people like that. And it was that kind of tradition, because for me, Christianity is far more than a religion. It's a philosophy of life. It's a way of behaving. It's reaching out to the very poor. And so when I became Archbishop of Canterbury, it was that kind of thrust that motivated me to say one must do something about it. So I inevitably got caught up in politics. In fact, you can't be a Christian, or for that matter, I imagine, a Muslim leader, and ignore politics. Politics is the driving force of change, and as Christian leaders down the centre have found, if you want to change things, inevitably it takes you out into the political arena, into the public square, and that's where faith truly belongs. So as an Archbishop, I felt I had a considerable contribution to make to the life of our worldwide community, because the Anglican Communion is a worldwide church. And one of the first people I met up with as Archbishop was a remarkable woman called Baroness Linda Chalker. She was the development secretary in John Major's government. And I got to know her, and Eileen too got to know her, because she was doing some remarkable work. In Africa, she was known as the Great White Mother. She was very proud of that description. And it was actually my very first visit abroad. And I ought to say this, to my shame, that when I became Archbishop of Canterbury in 1991, Eileen will correct me, I don't think we had visited America before that. We hadn't visited Africa. We had visited Australia and New Zealand, Hong Kong, European countries, but we knew nothing really of the depth of suffering, particularly in Africa. Our very first overseas trip in 1991 was to Papua New Guinea, PNG, and this opened our eyes to a dimension of poverty that we had never seen before. And the very day we went there, a report from the World Bank came to me through the post, pointing out the terrible plight of Africa, particularly 1.3 billion people living on under $1 a day. Linda Chalker brought this to my attention, and we had a discussion at that particular point with Linda about what the church can do about this. This was followed up by a meeting I had with the Secretary General of the United Nations, Boutros Ghali, who actually opened my mind and heart to another dimension of this, when he actually chided me, and it was a chiding that I took to heart, because he was saying, religious communities like yours should be a powerful player in issues of development. And he handed me a document which you've probably come across, the UN Development Programme Human Development Report for 1992, which showed that in the 1960s, the richer countries were 30 times wealthier than the poorer ones. That was in the 60s. But by the 90s, the gap had widened so that the wealthier countries were now 150 times wealthier than the very poor. And Linda Chalker drew my attention to that report, that the poorer countries were actually receiving less than half of the aid promised by wealthier nations because of the debt scandal. And you will remember in the mid-90s, the issue of debt took up a great deal of time. So I began to see as an Archbishop that the issue facing us was a slavery as deep as that Wilberforce confronted, but a different kind of slavery, because Africa was in bondage to a different kind of bondage. I was sorry to some degree that Boutros Ghali only had one term of office, because I thought he was a very effective Secretary General. But I got to know his successor very well indeed. In 1996, I began to hear about the Jubilee campaign. Now this may be a very British slant on things, and forgive me for that, but there's no harm in giving you a UK view of this. But I don't know if the Jubilee campaign hit the States, but it made a very remarkable contribution in Britain. It came out of the Christian Aid, and there were two men, Martin Dent and Bill Peters, who hit upon the idea of linking debt to the concept of the Jubilee in the Old Testament. And that was the remission of debt every 50 years or so. And it was a very brilliant idea. And two very remarkable women joined these two men, Isabel Carter and Anne Pettifor, two fantastic people. And this visionary quartet hit upon this idea, how can we raise the profile of the debt issue and do something about it?
So this was building a tremendous momentum onto the meeting of the G7 leaders in Birmingham in the year 1998. And there were the political leaders, the G7 leaders, gathered in Birmingham. And I heard firsthand from Gordon Brown, who was there as our Chancellor, that when the delegates got up that morning in their hotel, surrounding them were thousands of trade unionists, but particularly Christians, Catholic, Anglicans, Methodists, Baptists, surrounding them in a kind of silent thing with waving banners, the Jubilee campaign. Gordon Brown said to me later, they were saying, the delegates were saying, who are these people? Where did they come from? The church had arrived in great number. They'd become politically active. And then Linda Chalker was followed by, when Labour came to power, by another remarkable women. And women feature in this a great deal. Claire Short, who you will have met many times indeed, a lapsed Catholic. She often called herself a cultural Catholic, but actually her faith was actually very real in her life. She was actually initially very worried about focusing on debt, because she said, countries have got to honour their commitments. In the same way, if you and I fall into debt, no one's going to give us remission. The banks certainly won't. So why do we expect that nations should be any different? But when she saw the issue of what was actually happening, in the case of Britain, for every £3 we gave away, one we were extracting in terms of servicing the debt. It was a colossal imposition. But what it did do was to emphasize that the churches had a remarkable contribution to make. It was with that kind of background that I started to visit parts of the Anglican Communion, and I began to see the world through the eyes of the poor. Sudan, which we've been to 5 times, particularly impressed us. Not merely in terms of the clash between Islam and Christianity, because in many respects the two faiths in many areas were getting on extremely well. But we're able to see what poverty was doing to people, and particularly women, and we'll come on to that in a moment. So I began to see as an archbishop that I had a power of advocacy that I hadn't begun to exploit. And I think we as Christians ought to realize that being an advocate for the poor is a very important thing to do. We can do it at many different levels. So I started to do that. I remember a dear friend, a Christian MP, said to me one day, he said, when you go on your travels and you step out of the plane and the officials are there to greet you, do you ever ask them who speaks for the women and the children? And I had to say to Andrew, this MP, no, I've never thought of it, but from now on I would do it. And when we stepped out of the plane and people said, I'm the minister for this, who speaks for the very poor? How can we hear their voices? And this actually is quite an electrifying question. The importance, though, of advocacy on behalf of the invisible poor took a very interesting form when in 1997 a World Bank official phoned my office and asked if I would be willing to speak to the new president of the World Bank, Jim Wolfensohn. He was a successful businessman, already making waves in the bank through his hands-on approach, his dynamism, and of course he was also making all kinds of waves because not every person in the bank wanted that kind of president. But he met me, and out of that meeting came eventually, after the embryonic form, WFDD. But what was so impressive about him was his willingness to think outside the box, to approach a very strange possible ally in the religious community when the bank is by nature secular, representing all the governments. But what brought home to Jim the importance of religious community was the visit he had just made to Tanzania. And he was talking to government officials and so on, and he realized actually that the bank was giving money to the government, but the churches and religious communities on the ground were doing so much in terms of health, aid, gender issues, farming. In fact, my days when I was Bishop of Bath and Wells, it was from Somerset Farms that we were sending cows to Africa, to Tanzania in particular. And so Jim started to say, why are we processing all this World Bank grants through the government and ignoring the extensive religious networks of the country? And it was really out of a discussion over the phone that we hit upon the idea that we would bring together representatives of 9 world religions to Lambeth Palace to see if a partnership could be forged between the World Bank and the religious communities. Very unlikely bedfellows in many respects. And so the following February, Jim and his team, we were involved in that initially. Yeah. Catherine came into it then just a little bit later, but Jim and his colleagues swept into Lambeth Palace. I found myself facing a man in his late 60s, of middle height, with a shock of white hair. And the most remarkable thing I found about Jim was his very direct way of speaking to you. If you know him, you know exactly what I mean. It's a very Australian way of talking and down to earth. That suited me very well indeed. I came from a working class background. I was used to speaking my mind, so we got on very well. And I was so delighted to meet a political and business leader who took religion seriously, although I have no idea where he was coming from. I guessed from the Jewish tradition, but that wasn't the important thing. Both of us wanted to make a difference. And as I looked around that conference in the great guard hall on that morning, it was the beginning of a 2-day meeting, I thought, what an extraordinary sight this is. Around this big table, there were people in different garments and uniforms, and the color was quite amazing. And quite soon, after the initial speeches that I gave and Jim gave, an Indian woman, a Hindu, hammered the table with enormous force. And I could see that the conference was going to end very quickly indeed. She saw the bank as a great secular evil with its program of structural adjustment programs, SAP, rigid policies. She said the bank does more harm than good. And Jim sitting next to me, I could see he was losing his cool and wondered what he was going to say. She had just said that the World Bank was the mother and godmother of all banks. Jim interrupted the tirade and said, we are not a bank. We're the largest foreign aid agency in the world. We are owned by all the governments, including our own. The World Bank has no money of its own, and what it has comes from your governments, and we are accountable to your governments. If you think that the bank is trying to feather its nest by extracting money from the world's poor, you've got completely the wrong idea. The bank exists for one purpose only. It wants to bring people out of poverty. If you believe that's an honourable thing to do, then we can do work together. And after that twofold tirade, if you like, that tough exchange signalled that we are in the business of appraising strengths and weaknesses and a new partnership. Yes, there was recognition that the bank and other secular organisations had been guilty of neglecting the role of religious communities. of focusing not enough on conflict resolution, poverty reduction, and advocacy. But Jim and his colleagues were equally concerned that religious communities were somewhat inward-looking, and there was a need, really, to challenge one another. And one of Jim's senior assistants pointed out a structural problem with faith communities. They were admittedly often very close to the very poor, the very vulnerable, but very often their traditional methods impeded progress, especially when it's to do with gender issues, contraception, and work. The bank's analysis of religious communities showed that some, if not many, were into survival mode and were not transformative communities. And Jim and I saw that a very effective relationship could be a twofold challenge, with the bank challenging religious communities to face up to their own endemic weaknesses. On the other hand, to challenge the bank to get the money through to the very poor and to make change, you can't avoid or bypass the religious communities. And I can say much more of that. There was one lovely exchange, though, when the religious representative from Côte d'Ivoire very wittingly compared the World Bank to a creature that I'd only heard of, I've never seen one, the pangolin. The pangolin is a cross between an anteater and an armadillo. The pangolin is very rarely ever seen. It lives in deep holes in the forests. You rarely see it, and the speaker went on to say, the visit of a World Bank official to my country is rather like the appearance of a pangolin. When he appears, everyone gathers around it to admire the strange creature, which of course is a very polite way of saying, well, where have you been all the time? That was the way the World Bank was seen. From that first historic meeting, in which the World Faith Development Dialogue was born, we sent out a communique which read this: "This has been a precious opportunity for frank and intensive dialogue between religious leaders and development experts, drawn from 9 of the world's religious faiths and leading staff at the World Bank. We are strengthened in our conviction that the definition and practice of desirable development must have regard to spiritual, ethical, environmental, and cultural and social considerations." And that was the birth of the World Faith Development Dialogue. Now, Jim and I were very pleased, excited by the success of that first meeting. And then a bombshell hit us. And this is, of course, where you played a very important role, because when Jim was away, the World Bank board met, and I think you had to give a report to it, and I'll ask your comment from you later, but the World Bank refused to endorse this unique agreement between the World Bank and religious communities. The French representative, keeping faith with the secular straitjacket they're in, particularly objected to the principle of a secular organization talking to religious organizations. And so the president was instructed to break off all official links with WFDD. Jim, on his return, was deeply outraged and very upset, but there was very little he could do about the structural level. The work, he was determined, would continue, and he and I continued in co-leadership. He poured in a lot of his own money into that. We got money from the Aga Khan, from other people as well. But you know, it was a very short-sighted attitude from the World Bank. And I remember the day after 9/11, I was sitting in my office in Lambeth Palace. Jim phoned to say, he said, it's ironic. I've just had a board meeting and several of the people said, this idea of yours of having a relationship with the religious community, the idea for it has come. Because of yesterday, we are convinced of the worth of it. But in a sense, it was a little too late. And we've been, I think, staggering on ever since. Let me, for the sake of conclude this. In some of the things that Ida and I have done in the Anglican Communion and elsewhere, and particularly with WFDD, is to focus on issues of gender. I believe that this is so important because when Ida and I went to Tanzania, we've been several times, when we went into the depths of the countryside, when we saw evidence of the Send a Cow program that our country was involved in, I asked several people, why do you choose a woman to place a cow with? It was invariably the woman. And the official said, we can only trust the women. The men, we saw them playing cards. It was the woman who would go 9 miles to get water and trudge back. The woman was reliable because this cow was often the only link to survival. And gender, of course, as we know, plays a very important part in improving the lot of the very poor. Better educated girls marry later, bear fewer children, greater success in the work market. And this is what a World Bank report summed up at that particular time. Women are one of Africa's hidden reserves, providing most of the region's labour, but their productivity is hampered by widespread inequality in education and access to resources. This greater gender equality, thus greater gender equality, can be a potent force for accelerated poverty reduction. So, concluding these brief remarks, WFDD still continues. We've got 2 programs. At the top level, it's a gathering of leaders where we can actually motivate people, change, bring religious and political leaders together, diplomats, and we've had remarkable meetings in Accra, in Dublin, in Canterbury, in London, in Washington. We want to continue that program because it's a way of actually, from the top, creating change. And secondly, and what Catherine is doing, in-country work, working street children with the Gates Foundation on various projects, malaria, working now with Tony Blair's foundation. It's an uphill struggle, but we're in it, we think, for the long term. We've just, this lunchtime, had a very encouraging meeting with senior bank officials, and I think we can look forward to the future with a great deal of optimism. Yes, we are overcoming so many of the barriers. We are getting many people out of poverty, but the gap is still very vast indeed, and there's a long, long way to go. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and we're open for
Yes.
comments and questions.
And I want to hear from you, so please, thank you.
Thank you, Lord Carey. I'm Kyle Vandermeulen, and I work at the Religious Freedom Project here at the Berkley Center. I was just wondering what you use as the benchmarks, and I guess, Catherine, this would apply to you as well, the benchmarks for success of the WFDD and how that might be different from a secular organization or the World Bank in itself.
I don't think there should be any difference, really. It should be possible to identify success and failure. And funny, interesting enough, we're closely connected with a charity in Britain called Tear Fund, and we are looking at that very question. We pour so much money into development, but do we actually do a thorough professional job in evaluating what is happening. And so it is possible. I mean, Catherine would have to answer that in terms of the detail of what we do in terms of copy work. But we're finding now, if we do a project on behalf, say, of the Blair Foundation or the Gates, the first thing they're going to say is, well, thank you for your report, but we want to know what difference you're going to make. That's a very key problem. Do you want to respond to that?
Well, one of the issues that we're dealing with both in WFDD and in the Berkley Center is that knowledge about what religious communities are doing in development is extraordinarily difficult to come by. And it's partly that there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of different organizations that are working in the development agenda, which is very broad. But the other is that many of these organizations have, shall we say, been a bit resistant to statistical methods, and therefore the data is often very patchy. There's a growing recognition that however much of a pain in the neck it is to have monitoring and evaluation, it is essential. What I, though, would add is that I think there are some real insights into some of the pitfalls of some of the excessively quantitative and rigid results framework, which are very much the pattern today. And so it's an illustration of an area where I think, as George was saying, that both sides can learn from each other. The religious communities have been very resistant to approaches which are purely geared to economic returns and financial returns. I mean, the reality is that you really have to go back to the 1970s or 60s before you find people who are really only looking at counting income as a measure. But it is true that there are many dimensions that get short shrift or that are ignored. But on the other hand, there's an increasing awareness that if all of these well-intentioned and highly motivated people who work in many areas of development are going to have the kind of adding up impact, that at the least they have to ask the basic common sense questions of what will it look like if it succeeds?
Yeah.
And how does it relate to what others are learning? How are you learning as you go along?
Any other points? Yeah.
Archbishop, I chair the Anglican Church in North America's Task Force on Islam and Interfaith Relations. I'd value a comment from you on where you see a dialogue, particularly between Islam and Christianity obviously under your leadership, the Lambeth dialogue with Al-Hazar, and where we're at with that, with perhaps what are the increasing tensions between the two faiths. Obviously in the last 24 hours, potential tensions and the tensions of the suffering church in places like Nigeria and elsewhere in West Africa.
Yeah, that's a very important question, isn't it, on that? Well, I mean, in my time, we launched the Building Bridges seminar after 9/11. I mean, 9/11 was a terrible moment, but what we should see that sometimes you get a moment which is terrible, out of that becomes an opportunity to take the dialogue forward, and 9/11 did. And so we've had a number of intellectual, theological dialogues going on, Al-Azhar you spoke about. And so at many different levels, friendships have been strengthened, but the political and religious cannot be separated. I mean, that's the thing I've seen again and again. And if we take Israel, where I was involved in the Alexandrian Declaration, where Shimon Peres asked me if I would co-chair with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar the dialogue between the religious leaders of the Holy Land at the very moment when the political path was going absolutely nowhere. So the frustration is the way in which the political affects religion, especially at the level of the very poor and the very illiterate, because what happens in Iraq and so on blows open relationships between other faith communities. And so the victims of Iraq have been the Chaldean Christians. And I mean, it's a very tragic situation indeed. So again, back to how do you actually assess and quantify success in that way? You can do it in terms of dialogue, taking that, and they will continue for generations to come, and getting closer. The initiative of the Muslim leaders and the Word document, offers a great deal of scope. And what we Christians mustn't do is to, out of politeness, as rather coyly, modestly, step away from our own faith, and as if to say it doesn't really matter. I think if we're going to get anywhere, it's going to be the strength of dialogue in the way that first WFDD, where you actually put on the table the differences. It's from the sharpness of dialogue you eventually get to a common and a recognition of the differences, but a way in which we can actually make this world a safer, better place for our children, living together with differences. We're never going to agree, but let's find ways in which we can at least live together and make a contribution to the common human lot.
I'm involved with an organization called the American Friends of the Episcopal Church of Sudan, which is either a cousin or maybe a niece or nephew of something called Sudan Church Association,
Yes.
which you have in the UK.
Yes.
And over the last few years, one thing that's become very clear to me and illustrated something that I think is very important about what religions can bring to the table in development context is that the ECS, the Episcopal Church of Sudan, and the Catholic Church are, by a country mile, the largest and most important civil institutions in Sudan, and maybe all of Sudan, but certainly southern Sudan. And this gives them an enormous potential for good, which supports development simply by keeping the lid on it.
Yeah.
In very fraught political circumstances. And they're working on peace and reconciliation among various ethnic groups, which is something that's very important. And I think generally just keeping the lid on it in a very difficult situation.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. And I think Sudan is a very good example of how the overseas church can actually help the people of Sudan. We were there last year in Yei, and through the civil war, every sort of element of structure has gone. Roads have collapsed and disappeared, and the poverty is very real. And I want to actually compliment the Episcopal Church on what it's doing. It's made a remarkable contribution there.
Well, the ECS itself,
Yeah.
has done a tremendous amount
Yes.
without
Yes.
as
Yes.
much overseas
And,
support as one might hope.
And the development now politically with the separation of North and South could actually benefit both sides as time goes on, because you can start to have a real political dialogue as the South becomes separate, and may eventually in time realize it has more in common with the North than it initially believed. Yeah.
Lord Carey, I'm wondering if in your work you've seen ways in which having different religious communities in a single country has work on development projects has caused them to work together better in areas like tolerance and for coexistence, as you alluded to, which are some of the biggest problems in development.
Sorry, the question you may not have heard at the back, can we cite those countries where different divergent faith communities out of that has led to dialogue and a difference. Is that the thrust? Well, you can actually take Northern Ireland as an example, where you've got two very strong communities, Protestant and Catholic, for 70 years or more. I mean, loggerheads. And you might say, well, okay, why have we now got a peaceful Northern Ireland? A number of reasons, really. The political dialogue was very important. Politicians who really believed change was possible. Bill Clinton. John Major hasn't got sufficient credit for what he did. Tony Blair was very instrumental in that, and the way in which the religious leaders played a part in this. And let's not forget the business world, because as Ireland became more profitable economically, so people had more attention on their families and their lives than killing one another. And so I think that aspect of it improved the economic lot of the poor. That's why if we want to make any change happen in, say, Palestine, there ought to be a greater effort in building up the infrastructure of Palestine, the areas around Bethlehem and for example. That will then strengthen the peace process. There are many examples like that, one can think of. I mentioned, I think of Lebanon again, where you've got very strong and strident communities. Catherine, can you think of others?
Well, the question of how far poverty fuels conflict and tensions among groups there are many examples. Nigeria. What's interesting is, I just was at a meeting the day before yesterday, and on Northern Ireland, you heard the same refrain that you hear so often: it's not about religion. It's not a religious conflict. And yet, it becomes part of the mix, which I think is part of your point, that it's inseparable in many ways from all of the different dimensions, and yet has been too little understood and analyzed.
No, and it goes back to the first question about freedom, because it seemed to me you cannot, in all these things, you cannot avoid justice. And in Northern Ireland, it was very unjust that Catholics were victimized by the dominant Protestant population. They couldn't actually, they were refused certain jobs. So there's a sense in which you've got to unpick that, empower people, welcome Catholics into the police force. So the last killing was a deliberate attack upon, they killed a Catholic policeman because they wanted to create the religious conflict again. They were going to the very heart of it. Yeah, Tom.
Two questions. One of the most important issues we've dealt with in the Palestine, Washington, or Jerusalem, Washington Partnership Committee of the Episcopal Church here has been how to do advocacy when there's so much anxiety about broken relationships in the interfaith dialogue. And at 7 o'clock tonight, we're going to get a report from John Chain about this very difficult situation of Bishop Suhail having his residence permit taken away from him by the Israelis on false charges, actually.
Yeah.
And so his family's at risk. He can't travel without the risk of not being able to return to Jerusalem. So we've been in that together and with others for a long time, but we've known about this since October, and it didn't become public because our bishops were afraid of violating their friendships with the people up the street at the embassy. How did you live with this kind of conundrum? You talked about we have to be not afraid to say the difficult issues and not worry about it breaking relationships. But in fact, it does break relationships if they think, or if they can charge us with being anti-Semite, when really our concern is saving Israel from itself.
Yes, I mean, I suppose one of the things that was most painful about being Archbishop was that very often people in the pews assumed at times I was doing nothing when I was working very furiously.
Yeah.
Because the moment a thing becomes public, very often that you've gone past the point of no return. I mean, I give an illustration, it's well known now, but when I was trying to heal the relationship between Prince Charles and Diana, the papers were accusing me of being weak on issues of adultery and so on. And when I had an opportunity, I would say to people, look, see the thing like a little parish, if you like. If I were to stand up in the pulpit and accuse so-and-so of adultery, you know what would happen? All my opportunity of healing the thing would absolutely be burst open. They wouldn't speak to me ever again. In other words, you're working at different levels. You're working privately, and this is what I think our leader has been doing in the Suhail situation, knocking on the doors of diplomats, working away, chiseling here and there. And the moment comes when you get nowhere with that approach, that's when you become public. That's when you start to raise your voice, and you do so in a polite way, but a very, very confident way in which you actually bring to the wider public issues of justice and freedom. Yeah. So those two levels have to go on.
But when you're in the dialogue behind closed doors, you never mince words about the unjust nature of it, and that's
right.
been my concern.
Yes,
We don't
exactly.
speak
Yes.
directly truth
Yes,
to
that's
power
right.
when-
Yes, yeah. Well, if you read any political, say, biography, you will find illustration after illustration of what they have said to one another behind the closed door. 20 years later, I said to him this, that kind of thing. And it has to be done. And if you're not really representing the people you care for, if you go in and you're too mild about it, there are times for toughness.
Catherine, may I be allowed a second question?
George's feeling.
Can you give us a report on if you've made progress in adding positive fuel to the fire at the World Bank about the partnership? A lot of us around the table have very close relationships with people of different faiths at the bank, but we're concerned that the fire has sort of died down since Jim left.
Well, I think we can say that we had a wonderful leaders. Our last leaders conference was in Accra 18 months ago. The relationship was very strong. We assumed we'd be able to move it and take it up a step or two into another gear. That hasn't happened. A number of reasons for that. We're working on them. One of the reasons, of course, is a financial aspect to it, and that is the World Bank is strapped for cash. It's cutting back jobs and having to shrink agencies. Now, that is part of the problem we have. But I think the meeting we had today was a very good one. We can work on it. We intend to, and more will come from it, sure. Shall we have another question?
Lord Carey, would you care to say a few words about micro-enterprise?
Yes.
A group I
Yes.
support, for example, is Five Talents. You may know more about them
Yes.
than I do. How promising is all this, and are there any new directions that people haven't generally heard about?
Well, I mean, I think it's a very thrilling thing, and in many parts of the world, micro concerns. We can think of one in Tanzania, where one amazing woman is doing a fantastic work, and with Lord Griffiths, Eileen and I have been part of a group of people raising money. In fact, we've got money from Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and other people who poured money into these commitments. I really do think, and very often, this is ideal for women to overcome the handicaps they have. So I think this is something to put money and backing into, but it goes back to the first question: how do you evaluate success? And we hit upon a particular problem in Tanzania, where the person who was most keen for us to get this going, a Tanzanian, actually wanted his family to be the recipient of the money. And so an element of objectivity was being lost there. We had to say, no, we can't do that. Can't have favourites. It has to be built upon the imagination and enterprise, and we will then apportion money in a proper way. We were quite disappointed by that kind of response. Yeah.
There were two things that fascinated me in your presentation that you made, and that was the first one, in dialogue with other faith traditions. You know, often we think we have to give up on our own faith. But I think the dialogue has strengthened us in our own faith.
Yes, it does.
But in addition to that, there's not only a dialogue between faith groups, but faith groups with political groups as well. Just very recently, Rajiv Shah, the director of USAID, invited faith-based organization and they invited them to participate with USAID in doing development work. In the past, it's interestingly, many faith-based organizations have, should I call it, compromised, because they wanted to get this non-political money, or maybe political money. And because of that, they had to give up their stand on faith kind of standards. And I think that's the same thing applies to faith-based organizations dialoguing with political powers. They have to, in that dialogue, often strengthen their own faith and their own commitment.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, it's quite a difficult one, this really, because you can understand people saying, what is their agenda? If you've got a strong faith community and they want to help out and say medical work, so if you don't come from that tradition, you're going to actually say, what are they trying to get out of it? Is there a proselytizing tendency coming through this? And you can only overcome that by your history, in fact what you've done before, which convinces people we've got nothing to fear, and secondly, B, the friendships you build up across the divergent communities. It is such a pity, actually, and I've seen that happen again in England and elsewhere, that the people, we seem to say, if we are weak in our own faith, we're more likely to attract support and money, but if we're strong in it, we're going to put people off. Now, I hope I'm a strong Christian, but I hope it doesn't present a problem, because I think I can actually say there are two aspects here. I can be strong in my faith, but at the same time, I can say my first priority is not to recognize that person as a Muslim who I'm intent on converting to Christianity, but here is a human being who's very poor, and it's an act of faith on my part to bring that person out of poverty or to heal the sick.
Lord Carey, actually, I'm the president of Five Talents, and we've met before.
I
so
know.
Thank you very much for that.
Which is doing a wonderful work.
Well, Mama Bahati is doing very well. The Tanzanian project is going very well. But I think, Catherine, I think this is a very important conversation, and I was always sad to see that the World Bank kind of, I'm glad you're back into that conversation, because the point that you made about Christian organizations or Muslim organizations, and when you start looking at financing organizations as we do, how does the church and organizations affiliated with the church or working with the church be able to kind of put aside some of those fears of proselytization or evangelism when that happens in a lot of places because of the action of the church or the work that we're doing on the field. So I don't know there's an end. I think this is where I think the world faith dialogue becomes important, because using these examples from different faiths about how they're working with the Lord, and in a scalable manner, in a measurable manner becomes very important. So I'm hoping that that's something we'll look at. Because I think the measurable part is very, very important, and then the scale of like the Anglican Church in general is huge. But there's no, you can't tell us the whole story because we don't know the whole story.
Yeah, well, I do want to say how much, how thankful I am for the work of Five Talents. It does a fantastic work. If you don't know anything about it, see this fellow afterwards, because it is making a real difference, empowering very poor people to develop their skills of enterprise. Wonderful.
Good to hear you say that the political world and the religious world need to interact, and it seems so painfully obvious, but in our country it's in our DNA. Formerly the state and the church are separate. How do you see the church affecting political change?
Well, in your country, I mean, I've taken a great deal of interest in the origins of faith and politics in your country, and you will know from the very beginning, faith and politics was never separate. But this was the land of the free, where people could practice their religion, whatever it was, but it was never meant to isolate faith from life. And I think there's been a distortion of that reality, and it's come about in the last 20 years or so. In the same way, the secular agenda in my country is now very driving change, I think, negatively, and we have to watch that. But I think, going back to your question, in both our countries, actually, there's a need really to encourage Christian leaders, Christian politicians, not to be ashamed of their faith, but to see it as a very natural way of living. That's why I'm glad we've got a Prime Minister now, David Cameron, who actually is a practicing Christian, and he's not ashamed of it. He's seen to go to church, and he speaks regularly to church groups. So we've got to actually encourage them and help them to see that, in fact, actually, if they try to prize religion away from politics or from living life as a human being, you can't live like that. I mean, it's very much part of the DNA of what it is to be a human being. Your faith is very important to how you behave. It very much is the source of how you behave. So that's all I can say in approaching your question. But I'm delighted. I think I see signs in my country that under the very aggressive secular agenda from Dawkins and so on, quite a lot of people are saying, hey, this is going to lead to a very shallow civilization and a coarsening of our society, and we don't want it. And people are now coming out of the woodwork, which is very good.
I think one dimension of this that's an interesting link to the discussion with the World Bank. The World Bank, of course, has in its articles of agreement that it cannot be involved in the internal politics of its member countries. And yet, the issue that's the most political that exists is poverty. I mean, poverty is about power, it's about opportunity, it's about justice, it's profoundly political. And so, in a sense, the focus on poverty draws both the religious and the development world into a set of very complex political issues, which are at least one route into that.
Yeah. And we mustn't forget the issues of environment and pollution. That very often is the poor that actually is the first victim of changes to ecology and environment. And that is, in my country, very often in recent years we've seen issues of environment as actually is now the first priority on our agendas, and so development and issues of poverty is driven underground, and I think that's such a mistake.
Archbishop, I wonder if I may share a personal note with you. I was living in the UK 20 years ago, and at that particular time the government was being, shall we say, a little negative towards single mothers. and you were one of the voices who spoke out very positively. As a result of that, I, who was a single mother on welfare, decided that I kind of like this church that you were from, and I am now a priest in the Episcopal Church. But anyway, times have changed quite a lot for me. My daughter's graduated as a lawyer. She's volunteering over in Cambodia just now. So I think from a personal stand, I just want to thank you for the way that you did stand out and support, and I think you got your knuckles rapped a couple of times for interfering in politics. But I also wanted to say that a few weeks ago, my husband and I, Paul Marshall and I, were in California meeting with Rick Warren, and he was talking about medical care for people, especially in Africa and different places. And he said that he had made a note of there was just maybe 3 hospitals that people would have to walk days to. And then there was a few more medical centers that they would have to walk perhaps a day to, and maybe you already know this. And he's now trying to train people in the churches, which was so much more, to have basic medical training. And this seemed to me to be an important key. Again, helping the people who are in the field and in the churches, empowering them to do the work rather than kind of flying in and trying to impose, what we know. And he said, I have so much I could tell people about what not to do when you're trying to help us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for what you said. I'm deeply humbled by that. Secondly, I think one of the things that we need to do, I'm speaking representing the Christian faith, but there may be other people here from other faith communities. The issue for us is how do you hold on to the strength of your faith without it being a barrier to others? How, in other words, let me clarify this, how can I be a strong Christian with high moral standards and yet have the capacity for compassion and to reach out in the vision of Christ to people with whom I may disagree? And that is the real moral challenge and Christian challenge, and it could be a Muslim challenge as well. I think we will only see effective work done when we could actually empower, for example, the strength of evangelical groups. We were at lunchtime talking about in Nigeria, one of the strongest churches there is the Church of the Redeemed? I can't remember the title of it, but it's so powerful. It's now a very visionary body in many respects, but quite a sharp body in terms of its doctrinal substance. And we might recoil from that until we realize actually they've got strengths that maybe we don't have, and we've got to find ways of working together.
Is that what you hope for this, the dialogue, is to bring those ideas together, to bring those people together?
Sorry, say that again?
Is that what you hope for the base dialogue going forward, is to continue to do that, is to bring those examples?
Oh yes, I mean, that's right. I mean, I do think that the problems facing our world are very, very severe, and they're going to get worse. Although I said earlier, and I hope I'm not contradicting myself, we are overcoming many of these problems. We are reducing poverty, but we've not dealt with the population explosion. With diminishing resources, we've got bigger problems queuing up facing us. The events of last night could destabilize the world still further. What's happening in Libya and Egypt at the present moment, where is that going to end up? So we really need fresh collaboration, new collaboration. We've got to work together. If our goal is actually improving the standard of the very poor, then we've realized that we, the richer people in the world, have got to give up more if we're going to get anywhere at all. Thank you.
I think we're very convinced that by a dialogue, and by dialogue we mean not just words, but a genuine openness to transformation and of understanding between the worlds, the secular and the religious worlds, and among the many actors involved, that the quality of development will be much better. that there are insights, knowledge, experience on all sides which are not shared and which are very imperfectly understood. And there's a great deal that we can achieve if we're able to get these rather difficult,
Yeah.
strange bedfellows
Oh, yes,
to
yes,
work
yeah.
together.
Yes. Well, thank you very much indeed. Shall we pull up stumps at this
Well,
point, or you want to carry on?
I just saw one hand go up
Okay.
as you were starting, so perhaps
We'll
we
have one last contribution.
Your first question was, who is speaking for the poor?
Yes.
I think that's a question that is very relevant at this moment, where financial constraints are making governments to cut finances. And there are many lobbying groups for various financial assistance, but very few for the poor. And what an opportunity for churches to be involved in the lobbyists, so to say, for the poor.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. And you know what changes people? It's people going into the places where the poor are. In Christianity, we call this incarnation. And you know yourself, if you represent a church, if you take a group of people to Palestine, to Nigeria, to Sudan, you find they return home changed because they see what needs to be done, and you get them motivated, which is worth 10,000 sermons.
Oh,
That-
sorry, can we have one more, George?
Yeah, of course.
Do you have the strength?
I
Yeah,
just
of
wanted to
course.
ask you, Archbishop, how unifying and effective is Anglicanism on the world stage? I mean, it reaches out to more than 38 countries, right, as a communion?
Well, I mean, I'm very proud. I'm very proud of Anglicanism. It's a form of Christianity where we hold together the evangelism, go into the world and preach the gospel, and on the other hand, the mission of Christ. We call it the Missio Dei. And that's so important. So our agenda is really twofold. We want to build up the local community through evangelism, through sharing the Christian faith. But our deeper motivation is to follow the pattern of Jesus Christ in creating community, in bringing issue of justice, freedom to the world. And the things are so interlinked in so many ways. So I think when I look at the contribution, for example, my church, the Church Missionary Society, what do? They, as the British Empire expanded, so the missionaries went out to educate and to heal. And those two prongs. I remember with Eileen going to many a place in Africa and seeing those ancient theatre beds with the date on 1908 or 1876, still using them, actually, incredible. So we can be pleased and humbly proud of that tradition of care, which I think is still needed today. Practice what you preach.
Well, on that, I'm sure we could continue all night, but let me thank you so much, George, for a very inspirational speech with a whole set of insights, and for your generosity in reflecting on so many different questions. And thank you to all of you for coming at a busy time of year. We appreciate very much your being here, and look forward to seeing you again at other events at the Berkley Center.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you all.